Matt Wolf, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Opal?
I'm good. I'm good. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. I am a big fan of this film. I'm super, super excited to be presenting it to audiences this season. Um, I would love to get into a bit of the history, as well as some of the craft that you engaged in to make this wonderful film. So let's dive into another hayride. So Louise Hay is your character here, but we kind of enter her story through one of the individuals who were in her community. So can you share what came first to you? Did you find out about Louise first, or did you find out about David Alt, who's the narrator?
I found out about Louise first. My friend Olivia Lang, a British writer, has a new book coming out called Everybody or Everybody. And I read the manuscript for it, and she has a short piece about Louise Hay in the book. It's a book about bodies and protests. And I was intrigued by a woman who mostly has been, I think, considered pernicious in the early days of the AIDS movement, or really
Hmm.
the early days of the AIDS pandemic, in which there was a lot of confusion about the nature of the disease and its treatment and transmission. And Olivia wrote about her, and I asked, do you think this would be a good subject for a short film? And she said, yeah, definitely. So this is mid pandemic. I hadn't been in production or making anything for months. In
Right.
fact, a production that I was supposed to do had been canceled, and I was kind of determined to make something. So I kind of went searching on eBay for Louise Hay VHS tapes, and
Ah,
I
okay.
found them and had them transferred. And I make a
Hmm.
lot of archival films, and immediately was struck by the quality of this footage, how it really tapped into the kind of new age aesthetic of the early 1980s, and how Louise was this kind of captivating and to some extent confusing personality at this
Hmm.
very specific moment in time that also resonates with what we're going through in a global pandemic right now. And
True.
so, I decided, yes, I think there's enough material here to make a film, and I'm going to do it all by myself, which I haven't done in years. I haven't edited anything in maybe 5 years, but I wanted to kind of make something in the scrappiest sense on my own terms during the
Hmm.
pandemic. And so I started to do research, and I encountered a few people who had been part of Louise's Hayrides, as they were called. These were healing
Yeah.
circles, predominantly for gay men who were dying of AIDS. And I came across David Alt's name and connected to him. And it turns out that he had been in this band called Alliance, a kind of new age
Right.
boy band that accompanied Louise as she gained prominence and was on tour around the country, doing motivational or self help workshops for increasingly larger audiences. And I've made a number of short films that are portraits and that draw on the voice of one sort of narrator. And I saw in David's story the ability to do that and to make a film entirely of this found footage. So that's how it all came together.
That's really fascinating because when I remember the first time that I screened it, what struck me was, what a time capsule it was, but also how you just sort of felt dropped into the experience of the community, and a lot of that is due to your brilliant convention of using one of the community members to bring us into it through David. I'm curious though, because in rewatching it in preparation for this conversation, Louise struck me as someone inconsistent, even within herself, as to what it was that she was doing, right? Like, a lot of times in the meetings, you hear her saying almost like positivity and, good thoughts and good nutrition could actually cure AIDS. But then, there were interviews where she's like, no, this is just about having a more holistic approach um, to being in a generally good space, and it's not about necessarily um overcoming AIDS. And it was interesting to hear David's perspective, who took her on as like a surrogate mother, that he knew she was coming from a good place, and this wasn't about her trying to be, to your earlier point, a character of, with ill intentions or anything like that. And so I thought it was an interesting device to, use someone in the community to kind of ground the audience's perspective, because indeed we're viewing all of her through the documentary that her team produced, right? The what's it called? The You Can Love Your Life, I think was
You Can Love Your Life is one of them, and Doors Opening is another
Doors
that
Opening.
specifically documented the Hayrides.
Yes.
Yeah,
So no, go ahead. I just thought that was interesting because she's, I'm like, wait a second. On the one hand, she's like, you boys don't have to be sick, and then on the other, she's like, it's not about me healing. It's just about me providing this, loving acceptance. And I think she probably wanted to do both, but it didn't seem like she was trying to be this shaman of like, come pay me money, be in my community, and you'll be whole.
Yeah, and I think that's what appealed to me about Louise, is that there's aspects of her that are problematic, or
Yes.
that in retrospect some might even call harmful, but also there was something benevolent and loving about what she was doing. I think it's important to remember, in the early days of the AIDS epidemic, I actually read in the LA Times a report that a significant percentage of Americans thought that people with AIDS should be quarantined, and some people even believe they should be tattooed. So it's hard to understand and recall the level of stigmatization of people living with AIDS, predominantly gay men, intravenous drug users, and women of color, people who are already obviously marginalized from the healthcare system. And there's a lot of parallels today in that regard as well. And so many, particularly gay men, face total rejection from their families as well. And I think we're seeking some sort of support, or you could say a healing experience in the face of insurmountable death, and really a death sentence with this pandemic, in which people didn't understand how it could be managed, and what it even was in these earliest days. And so I think, Louise was somebody who was open about her own trauma of childhood sexual abuse.
Yes.
And, part of what is tricky about her is that she claimed publicly that she had cured herself of cancer by psychologically grappling with the source of her trauma. So she always had a kind of questionable aspect to her philosophy. And when she came to the Hayride circles, she met other people who were facing trauma. And I think in that sense of connecting over trauma, she was able to play a kind of surrogate role as a mother figure, and to connect with a community that was, being treated like parasites at that time. She would physically touch people when, people in hospitals would be scared to touch patients with AIDS. So what she was doing wasn't being done. And I think it provided a lot of comfort for people. And as I learned from David Alt, there's, as he says, a difference between curing and healing. And that, healing in this space occurred, I think, on an emotional level for people who were incredibly isolated. Yet, this is contemporaneous with the emergence of activist groups like ACT UP, who were using direct actions to confront the government's neglect that was resulting in the, proliferation of this pandemic that was affecting marginalized people. And ACT UP, of course, was, had no cult of personality around a single, quote unquote guru. And it also was a much more diverse group. It's worth noting that the Hayrides is, very predominantly white gay men, which I think is telling and meaningful to a certain extent. But, I think in a sense, this idea of ACT UP versus the Hayrides and these healing circles, the differences are stark, but at the same time, both, could coexist for people facing different dilemmas in the context of this crisis.
No, absolutely. I'm so glad you unpacked a couple of things there that that I had noted and wanted to talk with you about. One, yes, and I couldn't help but looking at this through a 2020 lens notice how homogenous the grouping was, and what that spoke to of the time. But also this point about healing versus curing, which I thought was so such a rich thread to unpack, because and then to your third point about how this parallels with what we're going on right now. There are individuals who are making it day by day, right, and needing that connectedness. And it's not necessarily a matter of medical peril, like like the men we're facing is being diagnosed with AIDS. But it is a matter of needing this healing, of needing this connectedness. And that for me was on my first screening what resonated so powerfully from another Hayride, and its connectedness to what we're dealing with right now. I thought, my goodness, this is the human need for connectedness, and what it can give to us, even in a time when in these men's case they were medically imperiled, or for those of us it's more about just being locked down, being unable to do what we normally would do. How it is healing to the spirit. But I'd love to pick up on the thread of the communities, because I remember I looked at an article to also, I love films that make me want to go back in time and see, like, oh, like what else was going on around the
Me too.
context of this.
Me too.
And I looked at an article that once the Hayrides were gaining in popularity, folks were like, to other AIDS organizations, like, don't plan anything on a Wednesday night. Like, everybody's going to be, at the Hayrides. And I'm curious, in your research, what did you find out about why it was, this one particular community who tended to be participants in the Hayride versus, the more broad participants that you mentioned in ACT UP? Because again, I couldn't help but notice that. I didn't make any judgment necessarily, but I was curious about why that might have been the case.
Oh yeah, I mean it's very startling to see a room just entirely of gay white men, but I think in the queer community there always has been a kind of stratification of people around race and class.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked David about it, and I don't know if he had contemplated it before. I mean, his answer was, this started as a group of 6 men in the living room of Louise Hay in West Hollywood,
Mm.
and it grew from there by word of mouth. And he speculated that, okay, as a kind of tight-knit group of friends were telling other friends, and as a result, I think it's a reflection of what the West Hollywood gay kind of scene was at that time,
Mm-hmm.
or community. But I also think that ACT UP was so ahead of its time in regards to kind of intersectional activism, and drawing on other radical social movements to impact government response in the face of total neglect and invisibility from the mainstream. So I think ACT UP was intentionally creating a space where people of different backgrounds could come together, particularly communities who were affected by intravenous drug use.
Mm-hmm.
And as I mentioned, a lot of women of color predominantly were affected by the AIDS crisis early on.
Yeah.
And so I think it also raises a question about self-help, or the power of positive thinking as they think, or the kind of spiritualist movement that came out of metaphysical bookstores at this time in California. I'm really interested in that because
Mm-hmm.
some of the criticism of Louise, in fact, is that she made her name professionally around AIDS and then became a hugely successful nonfiction author. And you see in the archival footage that the crowds grow as she gains
Yeah.
prominence by appearing on Oprah and the Phil Donahue show, and her message becomes much broader than just to the AIDS community,
Yeah.
or healing yourself through, through certain foods. It becomes a more mainstream message, you could say. And she
Mm-hmm.
ended up starting Hay House, which was the most prolific and financially successful publisher of kind of, you know, quote unquote new age and self-help publications and books and tapes. So, you know, there's a lot of critiques to be made, but also I think communities come together in kind of organic ways. And this was a
Yeah.
community that very much reflected the gay men who were affected by AIDS in West Hollywood at that time, and then came to represent a much broader population of predominantly white women, as I can tell from most of the archival footage. But according to David, as the Hayrides became bigger and bigger, and over 600 people were showing up at these meetings, overflowing from gymnasiums, the crowd became more diverse. And maybe that's
Right.
a reflection of how the AIDS epidemic began expanding and affecting more and more people who were touched by it or afflicted by the disease.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That it was initially smaller communities, and yeah, grew to expand those bounds. Um, I'm curious, you said that you had gotten in touch with a few members of the community, and David is the individual that you chose to be the narrator. How did you decide on David, if there were, you know, other individuals you were speaking with?
I just felt like David could speak to a broader experience, but I also was really interested in his connection to Louise through this band.
Mm,
There was something kind of charming or unexpected about it, and I loved bringing in that archival footage and the music, and had seen that online. But I think oftentimes when I make feature films and in between, I like to make a short. It's come to
yes.
be a rhythm that I do between every larger project, and I've realized they're all taking on a similar form. I mean, most of them are portraits of artists or deal with queer history. I made a short film about the civil rights leader Bayard Rustin between my last two feature docs, and this.
Great
Thank
film. Great
you
film.
very much. And all of them are narrated by a single individual, and I think
Hmm.
the intimacy of that type of storytelling allows for a kind of portraiture that is on a smaller scale. And that kind of filmmaking really interests me. I'm not able to do it in a feature film, which is more panoramic in its scope. And so
Right.
rather than collaging a bunch of voices, to me, I want that immediacy and intimacy in the storytelling in a short film.
I love it. I mean, you know, remembering the feeling of watching your Bayard short, in both cases, you feel like you've spent time with, you know, someone who knew this main subject really intimately. So it's almost like you know, got to have a conversation, if you will, and you know, see like a video photo album, you know, through your use of archival, you get the actual footage, and you also get the first person voice. I think it's really effective and very impactful. So keep making these shorts, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I often say an interview with an individual is like a movie unto itself. There's a beginning,
Yeah,
a middle, and an end, and a kind of dramatic scope to what somebody covers in a long form interview. And so I've kind of become interested in actually making a movie out of a single person's interview. And more my films are becoming almost entirely based on archival footage. That won't be the case for another new project to come, but um, I love creating a world from the past and dropping you in a very direct way. And I find that being entirely immersed in archival footage is a pretty good way to do that.
it is. That is exactly the experience of watching this short. I'm curious. We get a snapshot in time specific to the Hayrides, but and you gave us a little bit of a glimpse of that. But what happened to Louise once she, you know, grew in popularity? And I mean, did she have a? Because I hadn't heard of her before this film. Did she have a sustained career until she, you know, retired or what have you? What was her trajectory?
I had not heard of her either. I did post a picture, a screenshot from one of her tapes on Instagram, and two people messaged me, "Is that Louise Hay? I listen to her tapes sometimes." And I didn't know much about her or this particular movement, but she went on to huge success. "You Can Heal Your Life" was an enormous bestseller, and you know, Hay House, her publishing imprint, was enormous, an enormous commercial success within this world of self-help. And I think the early Oprah episodes are really interesting to me because it shows a kind of early emergence of self-help and the power of positive thinking, which through Oprah, in a large sense, this kind of form of spirituality, a kind of mainstream spirituality outside of organized religion, it became hugely influential in popular culture. And Louise was always at the center of that kind of writing and lecturing. And she was influential all the way up until her 90s. And people I spoke to who were part of Hayrides, you know, they had enduring relationships with her. And I think there was a genuine kind of maternal bond between her and the gay men who she met at the beginning of her career.
That is magnificent. And so she remained a relatively uncontroversial figure.
No,
right? Like,
she was controversial, I think, in her legacy. I mean, I think in terms of, I think the self-help world, the world of this particular kind of spirituality and philosophy, it's an insular world, you know, and I think in that world, she was a beloved figure. I think in terms of queer history and reappraisals at the time of her death, I read some really kind of harshly critical stuff. I think her legacy within the history of AIDS, although obscure, remains quite contentious. And so I'm really interested in leaning into ambivalence and ambiguity. I like for people to be two things at once. I mean, sometimes people have said about films I've made, what's the filmmaker's point of view? And my point of view is not to guide the viewer to feel one way or the other about a subject, but to strategically organize information and anecdotes so that someone can hold two feelings at once, that Louise was an incredibly benevolent and important person, but that she also in some ways may have produced shame amongst people who didn't get better and who didn't become cured of the virus. And that, to me, that's a product of a time of incredible uncertainty and lack of good information, and that you can leave that film feeling two things, or people can feel different things. And that's really by design in not just this film, but in a lot of the films that I make.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate that, with particularly with portraits of individuals, because human beings are complex. Complex thing. There's no sort of, all good, all bad.
We can be multiple things at once. You and I both.
At once, exactly.
Are multiple things at once. We can hold two sides of ourselves. And I'm interested in both reappraising figures from the past, many who have been overlooked, like someone like Bayard Rustin, although he's a huge historical figure, but also, and to uncover these hidden histories, but to depict characters like Louise with the full complexity so that we can grapple with both the good and the less good qualities of her and the work that she did.
Well, that perspective, I think, is so deeply needed around public figures, because I think a lot of public discourse around complex individuals tends to want to fall into caricature, right? Like they're all evil or all good. And it's like, the more that we can complexify understandings of humans and human behavior, and the better we are. Nobody is all things that,
nobody is purely good or purely bad. I'm very interested in the potent mixture of both of those things and the legacies of people who may have been seen in a more one-dimensional or flattened way.
I just want to go back to this healing versus curing. When David said that, I wrote that down. I thought that was just so deep. Can you share a bit more about what he shared with you that meant in terms of his experience with the Hayrides community? Because he got to experience it on a much more exciting level, I guess, than most members, being a part of the boy band.
I think that was really the most important thing he wanted to impart to me, this idea that healing is different than curing. And I mean, something I think about as a gay man who, came out in the late 90s and, came of age at that time. the worst of the AIDS epidemic concentrated in the gay community had subsided in a sense at that time, not entirely, but in terms of peak pandemic at that moment. And so I really often think about all the people who are missing from plain sight, and how my generation has a certain kind of disconnect from a previous generation because of the extent of people who died. But I also think about and want to understand the trauma of people who lived when so many others died. And I think that being part of something like this, to me, could have potentially been healing, not for people who were facing death only, but also for people who were living. Whether it was a family member, a mother, a best friend, a lover, or somebody who wasn't HIV positive or didn't have AIDS, I think that there's a kind of healing that has to occur from the residual trauma of facing a pandemic. And obviously, as I'm saying that, we can't help but think about our situation now. I think all of us are going to have an enduring trauma from the loss and devastation of this moment. And it's in so many ways the circumstances are different. There is a vaccine on the horizon. People are the deaths will stop in a certain sense or diminish.
And there's no stigma attached to having it necessarily, right?
Yeah, and it's global. It's something that affects everyone. And yet there's a huge population of people who don't believe it exists or don't believe it's a real threat. It's very different. But I think all of us will have traumatic memories of this moment in time that can never fully be resolved, but that I think in time, we can heal, to some extent. And I've been thinking a lot about that, about traumas as it relates to pandemics, and that healing is going to be a necessary aspect of our long view.
Wow. And so what it looked like for him was the community and the acceptance and the love that she offered.
Well, David also, and this isn't hugely part of the film much at all, actually, he came from a really religious upbringing in which there obviously was a lot of homophobia. And I think this idea of chosen family became really important to him, as it is for a lot of queer people.
I was going to say that is queer life.
Exactly. It's true for so many queer people, is that you discover a chosen family at a certain time in your life, and that can coexist with intimate bonds with your birth family. But for a lot of people, that's what they've got, and I think David was, I think, immediately drawn into this chosen family that felt so supportive and loving to him. And that obviously Louise was this kind of maternal force that brought together this kind of familial community. So I think that was a big part of it for him too.
Amazing. Well, I think we're close to wrapping up, but I would love for you to, as we get ready to part, just say what you hope audience members will take away from screening another Hayride.
I want people to have complicated feelings about what's going on in the world now, but also to have recall of what has happened in the past. So often when large numbers of people die, their history is erased. And as a filmmaker, I'm really dedicated to preventing the erasure of history. It's very easy for us at this moment in time to depersonalize death and to depersonalize trauma and the scope of what is happening around the world. And I think we have to resist the erasure of history of all the people who have passed. And that's part of my preoccupation with the history of AIDS and making work that deals with the AIDS epidemic is to really honor the legacies of people who are missing from plain sight. And I think as filmmakers, it is a kind of activism in a sense to try to tell stories that will otherwise be forgotten and overlooked. And Louise is a complex figure, and people are going to respond to her in different ways. But this is a part of the history of a pandemic and a crisis that affected a lot of people. And I think it's, you know, intricately tied to an experience of shared trauma, and that's relevant today. And I want people to reflect on that, and to sit with the complexity of Louise, and the complexity of how they might feel about her and what she did.
Amazing. Well, we are so very glad to have your film with us at POV Shorts. And I thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me about it. And I look forward to seeing you in the flesh once this is all done
I
and over
know,
with.
I look forward to it. And thank you so much for including the film.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone.